Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. America's foreign policy elite appears to have no idea what it's doing. We're told Obama wants to obliterate the Islamic State using air power, but without helping Iran or Assad or alienating Sunnis. Talk about squaring a circle. What could possibly go wrong? To CrossTalk the Islamic State, I'm joined by my guest, Hillary Leverett in Washington. She is a senior lecturer on U.S. foreign policy at the American University, as well as co-author of the book Going to Tehran, Why America Must Accept the Islamic Republic of Iran. In New York, we have Stephen Schlesinger. He is a fellow at the Century Foundation and author of Active Creation about the establishment of the United Nations. And in London, we cross to Masume Torfe. She is a research associate at LSE and until recently, UN Director of Communications in Kabul. All right, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Hillary, if I can go to you, how do you have a policy to destroy the Islamic State, not encourage Assad, not encourage the Iranians, and not really annoy too many Sunni? I mean, I find it really quite remarkable. I don't know. This is like a puzzle, and I don't know what the reward should be if you can solve it, because it's unsolvable.
And it's self-inflicted. It was created here in Washington with the protests that broke out in the spring of 2011 in Syria. The decision here was to look at that not as a problem to help resolve in terms of conflict resolution, but as an opportunity to work with our so-called allies, particularly in the Gulf, allies like Saudi Arabia, to militarize those protests and use those protests as a way to weaken and then overthrow the Assad government in Syria, as a way to weaken and contain the Islamic Republic of Iran. That was a strategy that was even publicly briefed here in Washington. It ran in the New York Times. Yeah. So it's a strategy created here, and then of course it didn't work, and we're looking at the incoherence and failure as a result.
Well, Stephen, I mean, what Hillary just said there, the plan to destabilize and overthrow the government in Syria it's quite easy to understand. Okay, that's typical U.S. regime change. But what Obama is attempting to do, and oh, by the way, it will be the next administration that will finish off the job. It doesn't make any sense to me. Does it make any sense to you?
Well, I think it's a little unfair to suggest that the involvement in Syria and helping the people who were trying to overthrow the Assad regime was simply an effort to contain Iran. I think it was a genuine feeling that Assad was a dictator who was ruthless, and people wanted him overthrown the way other countries had in the enthusiasm about the Arab Spring, that this would be another change towards democracy. Obviously, it hasn't worked out that way, but I don't think it's totally fair to say it was all because of our desire to contain Iran. Now, I do have my feelings about what's going on is that I can understand that Obama felt he had to intervene because of the situation threatening our so-called ally, Iraq. I mean, even the Russian foreign minister, Lavrov, on Friday at the UN supported the Iraqi government in trying to ward off ISIL. So I think that there is a coalition of 50 or 60 countries now supporting this effort. I don't think it's simply, I think my problem with the whole effort is I don't see what the end game is, and I think that's the most troubling part of the situation.
Hillary, you wanted to jump in there real quick before we go to London. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Secretary Kerry, 6 months before we decided to seize the opportunity to militarize these protests in Syria as a way to weaken the government in Syria to then get at Iran, 6 months before that, when Secretary Kerry was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was wining and dining with Bashar al-Assad and his wife in Damascus. So this idea that we saw Assad as a dictator, that is just not borne out by the record that he was a dictator with whom we couldn't do business. The Obama administration and Secretary Kerry himself, when he was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, was focused on looking at the possibility of engaging Syria as a way, again, to peel it from Iran. But when we had the chance to go in there and militarize protest and do it that way and get the Saudis on board with that, we seized that opportunity. The idea that there's any feeling here for, poor people in Syria, that goes against the whole grain of U.S. foreign policy.
Masume, in London, how do you see the
come on, that's
let me go to our guest in London.
Well,
come on, you guys. Let me go to our guest in London, and then we can do all the cross-talking we want, okay? Masume in London, you've been listening to Stephen and Hillary. What's your take here? Go ahead.
Yes. I mean, there is no doubt that many of us would disagree with what Syria and Bashar Assad are doing. I mean, Bashar Assad is responsible for thousands upon thousands of civilian deaths. But on the other hand, we are also witnessing 13 years of mess. That's the best word I can find. Mess that has been created by mismanagement of international affairs. It started with Afghanistan and then rushing in 2003 to Iraq. And then, now we are facing IS. And you would expect that the American government would come up with some new strategy, because that's what was advertised to be. And we all got very happy that there's going to be this new strategy, these new alliances. But we get a speech from the president, from President Obama, which doesn't give us anything new, any new angles, any new alliances. And it's working with the old partners, old alliances, and still enmity towards the old enemies, such as Iran and Syria. I think the clever thing would have been to think bigger and to think of bringing on new powers who would be able to resolve, who have good connections. I mean, you cannot just bomb Iraq or Syria without having some kind of support from Iran and Russia. These two are absolutely
we'll talk
key
about the
as
outside powers in a second here, in the second half of the program. Hillary, we keep hearing about these mythical moderates, and I'm looking at, what happened in Iraq. They spent tens of billions of dollars training this army and security forces, and then they just disappeared. So we're going to try to do it in Syria now. The same thing. I don't get it.
And in particular, in Iraq, with the surge, the most praised surge in our policy in Iraq, we not only trained up the Iraqi military, but we in particular armed, trained, and funded 80,000 Sunni Muslim militants that we called tribal militias in Iraq, to at the time try to contain the precursor of ISIS, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was not only a complete failure, but many of those thousands, tens of thousands that we trained are now part of ISIS. So this idea that we can continue to arm, train, and fund Sunni militants has not just been a failure, but it has literally exploded in our face from the time that we started to arm, train, and fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to repel the Soviets. We did it there, we did it in Libya, we've done it in Syria, we've done it in Iraq. This is now coming together in a mass, cross-border, trans-border mass that has built the wealthiest, strongest, most sophisticated terrorist organization we've ever seen.
Stephen, there's no learning curve here. It just gets worse, actually. There's no learning about the past mistakes, and it continues. And now it's not only breaking up single countries, the entire region is ablaze here. Listen, when we listen to our guests in London, shouldn't there be a major rethink in how to approach this?
Well, no, I totally agree with our guests in London about rethink. I mean, the problem goes back to George W. Bush in 2003. I was adamantly opposed to the intervention of the U.S. in Iraq. I mean, without any UN authorization, totally unilaterally, it was absolutely a total disaster. And we're now suffering from the consequences of that horrible decision by the U.S. government and George Bush. But right now we have to deal with the reality of the damage created by that decision. And I don't think there's any easy answer. I'm very discontented by the fact that the U.S. is bombing at this point to prevent ISIL from taking over. I mean, once again, it looks like it's the Christians versus the Muslims, which has been so damaging in the past to the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. But on the other hand, what else do you have to do? I mean, it's nice to. The idea of bring the Iranians and the Russians in. The Russians are not about to put any troops in there. The Iranians are not about to put any troops in there. The only troops we're going to get are the Iraqis and maybe these so-called moderates. But honestly, I don't really see what other alternative. Did you want to let the ISIL take over Iraq?
No. There are plenty of options here. There are plenty of options.
I left the Bush administration.
Go ahead, Hillary.
No, it's important because I risked my entire career by leaving the Bush administration over its policies of invading Iraq, the axis of evil, and its war on terror. But it gives Obama him a blank check to go forward with the same policies, if not worse. Libya and Syria were entirely created on President Obama's watch, and he's getting away with it by continuing to put all the blame on the Bush administration, as much blame as they deserve. But it was President Obama's strategic failure, his decision to abuse the UN authorization to effect regime change, bloody regime change in Libya, and then to militarize these protests in Syria. We have to take responsibility for that failure and now go forward instead of trying to try to piece together these irreconcilable pieces by making a quid pro quo with the Saudis, for example, that in exchange for their help in defeating an ISIS in which they helped create, we're going to take out Assad. That is not just incoherent. That's going to be disastrous.
Well, let me just interject here. I think you ought to also address the fact that the Obama administration did try to get a political deal in Geneva with Syria. It wasn't totally dismissive of trying to work out some settlement. And indeed, with Iran, of course, we have ongoing talks about the nuclear issue there. So we're not, cutting off any possibility of a political settlement. And that, of course, is the crucial goal that we all seek in the Middle East.
But there's no,
so I think that ought to be part of the discussion.
But Stephen, there's no evidence of that. I don't see any evidence whatsoever the United States wants a political solution here. All right, I have to go to a short break here. After our short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Islamic State. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go to Masume in London. I think there are some opportunities and some strategies that haven't been thought about could actually be applied here. You wrote an article recently about Iran's possible involvement in solving this crisis in the Middle East, most recent one here. If and I'd like to ask all of my guests this, and if ISIS is the meanest, the baddest, the worstest, blah, 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 on and on and on, then it should take some imaginative thinking from the major powers of the world to get together, settle some of their differences, or at least put them aside a little bit. And I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about Iran, the United States, other countries to step up, because what has happened in the past has been one failure after another. So I'd like to ask my guests in London, what about a grand configuration to put an end to this ridiculously horrific organization?
Grand configuration is precisely what we need, actually, and my article was really not just about Iran, but it was about that grand configuration. I think it's no good to go on with the old narratives, and when you listen to politicians, they're the same narrative. I mean, it's just we have to destroy, we have to create more new groups to fight the old groups. We keep on building on these groups of terrorists on top of one another, and as Hillary was saying, it's no good. It's not creating results, and we need to think much bigger. We need to think in new terms and new narratives, and we have to bring in new alliances, as I said, and these new alliances must include countries like Iran, and Iran is in fact the only country that has been helping militarily on the ground, and is very passionately involved. I mean, I'm not a big supporter of the Islamic Republic, but it has been helping quite a lot on the ground, and it has been helping in terms of supporting the Peshmerga and also providing military support. And Iran has good relations with Bashar Assad, so Iran could be used for diplomatic gestures, for if the need arises for striking in Syria. It's much easier to do it through cooperation and understanding rather than just hitting targets that are not known. Iran doesn't want to be involved in any way in a US-led military action in the region, but Iran does like to be considered as an important, powerful regional operator.
All right, let me go to Hillary on that. Hillary, that's common sense. What we just heard was common sense. Okay, go ahead. Would you like to react?
It is, and one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Going to Tehran, was that I think that Iran is critically important to every one of to resolving every one of the current conflicts that we see that are so pressing on the international stage that go on in the Middle East, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Afghanistan, in Syria, in all of these places, Iran is absolutely central. But unfortunately, because of the continued path that U.S. foreign policy has taken, I'm not sure that at this point the government in Iran, that strategists in Iran, see it in their interest to join up with the United States as the United States is increasingly militarized these various protests and is bombing now, continuing to bomb not only military targets but civilian populations. It's now being perceived and talked about by Sunni clerics across the Muslim world as an American war on Islam.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Iran wants to join that on the side of the United States that appears like it's taking the side of minorities in the Middle East. That's a very dangerous path for Iran to join up to, and I think one of the reasons why you've seen the supreme leader in Iran put a bit of a quash on any Iranian participation in this kind of coalition. It's not only the narrative here in Washington that we don't think it's appropriate for Iran to come because they're not as well behaved as they should be in terms of the U.S. Foreign policy agenda. The Iranians themselves, even though they see ISIS as a threat, they have their own strategy, which is working for them. It's a long-term strategy. Teaming up with the United States in a war against Sunni Islam could be disastrous for Iran, and I don't think they're going to jump at that opportunity.
A very interesting point. Stephen, you want to jump in and react to any of this? Let me go to Stephen here in New York. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to tell you that I was at a private meeting with the foreign minister of Iran last week here when he was here for the UN session, and he was asked directly, are you upset that the U.S. has not included you in the coalition against ISIL? And he said, listen, we have too many other issues to deal with the U.S. We're focusing on the talks about the nuclear issue. That's our main concern right now. Obviously, you know, we want to defeat ISIL, but right now our most important issue, our dealings with the U.S. is over the resolution of this whole nuclear issue. So I think, you know, the two speakers are correct that Iran does not, at this point, really care one way or the other about getting involved in this coalition. I will say, though, that the fact that, you know, maybe 60 nations supporting this coalition that the U.S. has assembled, maybe it's paper thin, but the fact is that you do have 60 nations who seem to believe that what the U.S. is doing to try to defeat ISIL is a legitimate effort on the part of the world community to get rid of a scourge.
Go ahead, Hillary.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure, there's a
problem. There's a very serious problem with that.
Most of those countries will not participate in the air raids, and they will not put troops on the ground. I agree with that. That is a problem.
Okay, that's not the problem. No, that's not the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is that we talk about it as if these nations are with us. That is not what is happening. What is happening is you have unrepresentative governments, like the Saudi government, like the Emirati government, who are with us. Their populations, public opinion polling in Saudi Arabia in particular, shows those populations overwhelmingly against U.S. military action against ISIS. Al Hayat, the Saudi-owned Arabic newspaper, published a poll. They put it forward that showed that 92% of Sunni Muslims in Saudi Arabia think that ISIS accords with their definition of Islam and Islamic values. That is a problem for the Saudi government, and the United States, by getting them into this coalition, teaming up with them, is only going to accelerate pressure on the Saudis.
Okay, real quick,
there's 55 other nations you haven't mentioned in the coalition. Okay. So, I mean, if you don't mention the other 55 nations, you're going to focus on Saudi Arabia.
Hang on. Everybody hang on. I'm sure Australia's contribution will tip the scales here. Let's go back to London here. You wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to say that that is why we need to have new alliances. I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia have been one of the main causes of the creation of ISIS and lots of other little terrorist organizations, because they are in fierce rivalry about Sunnism and Shiism. And if you bring them together, this will create better relations between those two as well, and iron out some of the problems in that that way. As for Iran, as we were discussing in New York, Iran, I think, is keen to resolve the nuclear issue first and then move on to talks with the United States. And that is why the President Rouhani said in his interviews that he wants to deliver one baby first before he does the other. If that's it's not a very nice expression, but there we are. So that's what Iran is after. But also another issue that I want to get onto is that we mustn't think that it's just a question of IS or ISIL or ISIS or groups that are fighting in Iraq and Syria. Look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan still has Taliban creating serious challenges in 14 out of 34 provinces. And in one of the provinces, Ghazni province, ISIL or ISIS is actually moved in, according to reports that were published 2 days ago. So they are spreading their wings. This must go beyond coalitions in the region and with Arab nations and with Sunni Arab countries. It needs to go beyond that. It needs to look to other countries even wider than the region.
You know, Hillary, it's very interesting. I was trained as a historian. I was trained as a historian.
Hang
on. I'm going to Hillary. Hillary, I was trained as a historian and a modern European history, and I'm very well aware how when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the European powers redrew the map of the Middle East. And ISIS wants to destroy that. It made a big public announcement about that. But you know, the United States and its coalition of the willing, they're doing exactly the same thing. They're destroying borders, ignoring sovereignty, bombing civilians under conditions that are illegal under international law by any definition whatsoever. I mean, how can people in the region condemn ISIS when the outside powers delegitimize every single value they claim to stand up for?
Yeah, it's a critically important point, and it gets to this incoherence in U.S. foreign policy, which pretends to stand for sovereignty vis-a-vis some countries, vis-a-vis some situations where they are perceived in U.S. interests. But what's happening in the Sunni Muslim world is fundamentally profoundly important. We had a failure of a participatory Islamist political model in Egypt, where a U.S.-supported coup there overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohamed Morsi. With all of his failures, the key point here is that the U.S. government is now backing militarily with all of its might a government there that has squashed a participatory Islamist model for governance, as imperfect as it was. And what we're left with is this void, this vacuum, into which now we have ISIS, which I think our colleague in London is very correct to point out, is spreading its views, its practices, its tactics, its strategy, not just into Afghanistan, but even into Egypt, where we've seen beheadings of Egyptian police and military
Hillary, I want to be fair. I want to be fair to everyone. I want to give Stephen the last word. You got 30 seconds. Go ahead. I want to be fair.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think if you talk to the Egyptian military government, they would not have said that the U.S. participated in overthrowing the Morsi government. In fact, they thought we supported it too far and at too great length. So I think that's a little unfair to suggest the U.S. was complicit in any coup overthrowing that government. But in addition, I do think that.
All right. Everybody hold their horses. Everybody hold your horses. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, New York, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.